would like to keep symposium rolling, take your seat, grab a cookie on the way, and we are going to start things off with our industrial panel. Our moderator for industrial will be Angela Eldridge, Chief Operations Officer with Price Real Estate, and our panelists will be Tom Freeman, Executive Director of Cushman & Wakefield, Kyle Roberts, Executive Managing Director of Newmark Knight Frank, Jeff Richards, Senior Vice President of CBRE, and Jared Brooks, Senior Project Manager with Big D Construction. Angela.
I got the cushy chair.
Thanks, Vinny. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel today, and I just want to thank each of you for taking the time and joining us as real industry leaders and experts in this field. We're going to do this a little bit different, where it's going to be a pretty open roundtable discussion. So I'm going to ask a direct question, but please, each of you, pipe in whenever you feel like you have something to add to whatever it is that the topic is. But with that, we're just going to really jump in. I think with industrial, there's a lot going on, a lot happening, and a lot on the foreseeable future that each of you in the room are really interested to hear about. So Jeff, 2019, if you were to summarize it in one sentence, what is it?
Well, Angela, I look forward to answering that question. But first, in our prep for this panel, Freeman kept using the term industrial is the new sexy.
Shows true.
And this morning when I walked in and Kyle had his shirt buttoned down to about his belly button, is that what you were talking about, or what exactly what we...
Let's see it, Kyle.
All right, there we go.
Only Kyle can pull that off.
So there you go. So that's why industrial is the new sexy. In a sentence, 2019, industrial, I would say, was the year of the land grab and increased rates.
Okay, can you explain a little bit about that and talk about increased rates and kind of how that inched up also with the land values?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I was at an Envision Utah event, and the presenter there said something to the effect of, if we're not already, we're well on our way to becoming the most compressed population in the western United States. And if you think about where we live, in between these beautiful mountains, with mountains on the east and the west, lakes on the north and the south, and we have about 2 million people that want to live in this beautiful area, you can see how that comment is true. It's a very compressed area for all of these people to want to live. So I'll illustrate what's going on in industrial, but keep that in mind. So right now we have somewhere around 7.2 million square feet under construction. If you take just a standard coverage of 35%, which is, I would argue that we're seeing coverages go down, but meaning that 35% of the land is covered by the building, it would take about 450 acres to build what we're building right now, and that's just this year. So if you start to project that out year after year after year, you realize that we don't have very much land left. And over the past couple of years, developers and users the light has gone off. So this last year we saw land sales just go through the roof.
You know, I want to add to that. I think that we saw land not just in the core markets that we've seen, like in the Northwest Quadrant, I would even argue the Southwest Quadrant, but we're seeing that go to areas like Tooele and Brigham City and Eagle Mountain. We're seeing that what used to really be defined as three distinct markets between, I'm going to categorize the Weber-Davis County market as one, Salt Lake County as another, and Utah County. We're now seeing kind of a convergence into one big market because of that. So it's a very interesting time for sure.
And is that value driven for tenants to go out to more of those outside outlier markets like the Tooele Valley, like North Davis?
Depends on transportation thesis and where they are, if it's a network optimization play or if it's a super regional distribution play versus, moving more last mile, or if, they're in the contractor supply space or someplace where they need to be closer to population and construction.
But I think even those outlier markets that we're seeing, land values are still holding very, very strong. I think we've seen that across the board. I mean, there was a substantial deal done down in Utah County. Tyson Foods was the end user. That achieved a very, very good value. Infrastructure comes into play, for a lot of these more rural elements that will drive, some of those values. They'll maintain a pretty good value on even those rural areas.
You look at land prices that are 2-3 years ago, or you might find an improved parcel in the northwest quadrant for $475, $5 a foot. And we're hearing and seeing trades north of $850. So FAR under your building, you're talking $25, $26 land on the horizon under your building. And a lot of those sites are sites that have intrinsic construction challenges with them. They require lots of fill, geopiers, so they're more costly even than that. And a lot of that's driven by the institutional capital that's coming to our market because they have their core plus vehicles and their value add vehicles, and to find value add in what the typical context of that is, they're having to go vertical. They can't find it in existing product, so they're either sourcing capital with a local partner to do a development deal, or outright buying the ground and going vertical themselves.
Jared, kind of touching on both of the comments that have been given here, if 2019 for the brokers was considered the year of the land grab, on the construction side, we've talked a lot today about increased construction prices, material prices, labor shortage. What would you characterize 2019 on the construction side?
Yeah, to kind of emulate what everybody else has said, obviously labor's been a big topic of concern, and we've certainly seen that in the industrial side as well. But maybe what hasn't been talked about is the labor shortage that translated into the jurisdictions as well, with the city, fire department, public utilities, inspectors, planning and reviewing permits. They're seeing those effects as well. So those construction timelines are growing as everybody's very busy. And kind of touch on what Kyle kind of mentioned earlier with the land, as we're trying to grab land, we're having to expand out and get it closer to bodies of water. The land is just not as good as it was in the past, and we're having to, developers and owners are having to spend a lot of money to make that land usable, bring in fill, and it's a big construction cost. And then not only that, it ties into just bringing utilities into those locations as well, with power and gas and phone. And it's a difficult task to do that these days.
And we're going to get to some of that you touched on here in just a minute. But Tom, as the local representative for Amazon, what do you consider, we hear oftentimes the saying, the Amazon effect. What does that mean to you?
Oh, it's real.
Yes.
I don't think it's a secret.
Say so.
They've made a big splash in this market. To date, I think they're right around 5 million feet of occupied space in our market and growing. But I think there really is an Amazon effect. You can Google it, and it'll call out for a disruption of the retail world as we know it, both online as well as hard locations, as a direct result of growing e-commerce. I mean, when one retailer, or e-tailer as they call themselves, they control almost 50% of the online shopping in the U.S. $250 billion and growing. I mean, it's substantial. But I think that's only really part of the story. I'm grateful to be up here with these guys who have all transacted. There's a great story to tell about the state of Utah. It's been branded and touted as one of the most diverse economies in the country, if not the most diverse economy in the country, for all sorts of reasons. E-commerce makes up certainly a percentage of that, but there's been a number of deals, manufacturing deals, 3PL deals, which trends a little bit with e-commerce, but call centers. There's a very diverse, broad spectrum of industrial real estate, which is all very exciting. We mentioned Tyson Foods. Kyle just is completing almost a 1 million square foot deal with Henkel, who was a household name here. And Kyle, you feel free to jump in on that. And Jeff, who just did a deal with Cool Clothing. These are big impacts on our market. So,
I think it's probably easiest to describe the diversity. Little known fact is 40% of our market base is occupied by manufacturers of all throughout the strata. So assembly all the way through raw materials into packaged product. And we are the only state in the union that has 40% of its base being manufacturing and having it grow consistent with the base. So it's not a trend that is reversing as we have a bunch of bulk distribution product adding to the base as a total. You can drive around and look at a lot of the projects, large projects in town, and in Steve Price's portfolio, and in Freeport's portfolio and otherwise, and you'll see names that they're the Stryker Medicals of the world, they're the Haemonetics and Edwards Life Sciences of the world, and these are all very dense manufacturing types of operations, and it's probably the only portion of the real estate segment that has as much crossover with construction in terms of labor. And it's a challenge, and we'll get back to that a little bit later, but the position in the wage stack where a lot of the unskilled labor or semi-skilled labor might be forklift drivers or warehouse operators or those types of things, there's a lot of crossover there with the construction industry. So our segment of the marketplace, I would argue, has been more impacted and will continue to be impacted by labor shortage as much as anything. But the base of the manufacturing in our marketplace is fantastic because it's CapEx intensive. And it's very, very, very difficult for a manufacturer that might be spending 4 or 5 times in CapEx in their building what the present value impact of the lease will be. And that makes them very sticky. And then it creates all the attendant supply chain that's behind it that feeds it. And that's a core driver and will continue to be in our market for a long time.
We felt the Amazon effect with our White Mountain project in Draper. It was 2015. We put up our first building, and in trying to sell that property and come up with that development, I took developers around the South Valley and explained tenant size. And we determined that we needed to build buildings that had 7,000 to 10,000 square foot minimum bays. And the 600,000 square feet is now complete. We did exactly one deal at 7,000 square feet. And we did an entire building with FedEx, an entire building and a half with Ubiquity Networks. The tenant size just grew significantly throughout that project from 2015 until completion in 2019. So in 2008, 30% of freight was delivered locally. This year in 2020, 60% of freight will be delivered locally. So we'll feel that impact, that Amazon impact in the suburban industrial market.
I think a lot of people are concerned about the velocity of Amazon absorption in the market. It was, 60% of our total net absorption last year. But if you look at nationwide, our industrial absorption just continues to march forward. And 2 years ago, it was 70% 3PL across the country. Year after, it was 60. This year, Amazon will have a much bigger impact. So I don't think there's probably anybody in this room that wasn't receiving Amazon packages 4 years ago before they popped up their omnichannel facility. So there's going to be some displacement in 3PL, particularly in the last mile space. We're hearing our clients find that those margins are just not sustainable anymore for them with Amazon making a big play for last mile. But it's as you said, it's a part of the story. The base is very large. The percentage of their occupancy is very large. The impact on employment and transportation and infrastructure is felt good and bad. I mean, we wouldn't have the second largest UPS sort facility in the lower 48 without Amazon siting there, and that's infrastructure that benefits the whole market. But at the same time, you're going to have a mass of traffic that we've never felt and dealt with before in portions of our Northwest Quadrant. That's a result of all that shuttle freight going back and forth.
Jared, I want to get back to you really quickly because I think as developers, oftentimes we look to the construction prices and the construction pipeline to kind of forecast where we think the market is. Also, we get intel from our trustee brokers here to find out how many tenants are in the market. But I know, what do you look at to kind of see if there's a slowdown in the market? What does your current pipeline look like, and what would you forecast out as far as activity?
Yeah, well, first, 2019 was a very good year for the industrial market. Just internally, we delivered well over 2 million square feet, and there's more than 2 million square feet under construction right now, and we plan to deliver roughly 4 million feet in 2020. So 2020 looks very good for the industrial market, but we tend to look at the housing market and how lending is going as indicators of how the commercial construction market will follow. We're usually a year or so behind those. So as housing is doing well now and lending rates are well, we anticipate that the commercial construction and industrial will continue to grow so far.
And Kyle, kind of redirecting back to you, heading off of the lending, I know oftentimes, and recently, there's been such an increase in activity because there's been so much cash to place. Can you speak to that a little bit? The amount of available funds, the types of funds that are coming into the state, where cap rates are trading, and the amount of activity we have on the buy-sell side?
So we'll see our first trades sub-5 for core product in the Northwest Quadrant and in what I would call a Sono corridor, really from Sandy down to North Utah County based on tenancy. I'll touch a little more on cap rate, but I think probably the most interesting thing is the spread that we have historically seen for credit in even a single tenant lease transaction might have been 100 to 125 bips. That's narrowed to 25 or 30. So the credit of the tenancy on exit is far less important than are the walls, are the opportunity for upside and underwriting longer term increases in rent. You're seeing in our market for the first time much narrower premiums for very long-term leases because people are underwriting and speculating that rent growth is what's going to drive that marketplace going forward. And cap rate is, yes, it's a bellwether indicator, but it's probably the least focused on indicator for particularly the institutional money, that which is coming from pension funds and insurance companies and those companies that are tasked with placing it. And they're doing portfolio balancing all across the country because gateway markets historically have been the core plus. So, Class A product, good tenancy, divisibility in a high population dense area. I never heard the words core or core plus from institutional capital in our market prior to the last 2 years. If you were talking core in Utah, it was about what was left after you ate an apple. There was literally no core money here. And I'd say probably 2/3, if not more, of the interest we have in industrial in our market today is coming from those sources. And it is because of a portfolio balancing mandate that most of these advisors have. It's made it very, very difficult for exchange buyers to compete. Scale matters, as Kip said earlier. We have kind of an inverse relationship of size to exit cap. We'll have more players chasing a portfolio deal that has 4 or 5 buildings than we will chasing one, although that's still very robust. And the general thesis on Salt Lake, because of its economic diversity, because of population growth, because of working age, all of those things are driving focus on Salt Lake City. My friend Bryce often quotes the Hackman Index, which is one that comes out of the Gardner Policy Institute, and we have a 98 rating on the Hackman Index, which is a rating of economic diversity. That's the highest in the country by a significant margin, and that's a statewide metric. As our counties grow together, as we continue to see more capital flows come into Utah, it's viewed as a hedge, and it's viewed as a market where you can really underwrite rent growth, and that's the thesis for acquisition, and it's buoyed by all the construction that's happening in the marketplace, close to $11 billion of public infrastructure or public and private infrastructure that's going in from roads, airports, all the things that we've talked about today. So that makes replacement cost metrics and underwriting those a much easier process today than it has been in the past. And I actually think we'll see probably for the first time in our market's history some deals trade way in advance or well in advance of replacement cost, which is as much as price per pound or cap rate or IRR, the bellwether indicators that investors typically are looking at.
I want to say this is a pretty collaborative group, and I'm grateful for that. And it's changing even more because I can promise that any time a product is brought to market, everybody that they're talking to and everybody that I'm talking to is calling these guys to confirm everything that's being said, and we're grateful for that. But it's changing the way that I'm expecting to do business with these guys because I'm going to start asking for part of the fees now. So I think it's going to change the landscape.
How does that change?
Yeah.
So Jeff, I want to piggyback off of what Jared mentioned, kind of talking about the land constraints and how the current available land isn't the most ideal for developable conditions, so there's a lot more site work that's involved. Also in that, looking at their pipeline and how much work they have ahead, and with the labor constraints, primarily on the construction side, how does that affect tenants as far as their planning? Are they planning for it? Timelines are increasing. What does that look like for the developer-tenant relationship?
So industrial development is this tricky game because we knock out such large chunks of space at a time. So we plan our absorption period, and we have our developers that are almost in panic mode. And then after you sign 2 or 3 leases, they go into the other panic mode of, oh my gosh, my next building isn't up yet, and what am I going to do? So, and what we've seen with tenants over the past couple of years is that we just don't have time anymore. I think Kyle and Tom both mentioned that 3PL is a large portion of our market. And so the way that these companies work is they go out and they pitch on business. And when they go pitch on the business, they have to show that they have a lease in place, but they don't have a lease in place. So they have an LOI in place. Then they go win the business based upon that space. They come back to us and say, can you move us in 30 days? So we used to meet with tenants. We would have 120 to 180 days to build out the perfect office space and get everything buttoned up. We don't have that time anymore. So I'm appreciative of the pipeline. We need to be building with just over 3% vacancy, where it's actually an unhealthy low vacancy. And then the next thing that we recommend that our developers do is you spec some office. I can't tell you how many deals I've lost where the tenant comes in and says, can I put racking up next week? And if you can't get a certificate of occupancy, you can't do it. So if you spec a little bit of office, you're not going to guess perfect, but it's not the money-making space anyway. The warehouse space is the money-making space. So you spec some office, the tenant can then move in, get their racking permit, and get their stuff inside the building, start operations, and then you can fine-tune the office if you need to.
So is that a trend you're seeing or a trend you hope to see?
Both. I'm absolutely seeing it, and I'm recommending it.
We're begging
Yeah.
for it.
Begging for it. Tom, as you're working with tenants, maybe time becomes a factor where you might lose deals, but is there anything on the competitive landscape with Utah that really puts us above or below our competing markets? If you'll kind of talk about what that competition looks like. Oftentimes for a distribution center, they're siting regionally, so sometimes we're losing to Phoenix, sometimes we're losing to Reno, sometimes we're losing to Denver, but if you'll speak to where do we win and where do we lose?
You know, I love this question, and I think every group's kind of talked about it. There's a lot of great things about the state of Utah. I mean, labor is a big part of it, and I'm going to touch on that. To me is a huge driver. Any one of these large users, whether it's the UPSs, the Amazons, the Tysons, the Henkels, whoever it is, the first question that they ask, and by the way, their algorithms are plugging in populations, and that's what they're focused on, is their labor. And there's so many great things about the state of Utah when we talk about labor, we talk about growth. We look at birth rate, and it's the highest birth rate in the country. We look at immigration; it's one of the fastest rates of immigration. An interesting fact about the state of Utah: we have the youngest median age at 31 years old, 30.8 years old. As we think about those things, it's going to bode well for the great state of Utah for years to come as we contemplate labor. It's a highly educated, highly industrious labor pool here. So that's going to be, I think, at the top of the list. The other, we are very progressive. We've debated, and I'd love to talk more about infrastructure. That's been a huge topic of conversation. We think about infrastructure. The state has been very progressive with the $4 billion airport, a $1 billion prison. We've got billions of dollars going into highway projects. Those are things that I think all bode really, really well. And whether it's these rural areas or, these core plus areas that we are also familiar with, those are some real key elements that weigh into those drivers. We're a market now where you're seeing areas that are coming online with the Mountain View corridor, with the new interchange out in Tooele that puts Tooele 20 minutes away from an international airport. What city do you fly in today that you're not driving at least 20 minutes to, your location? So I think these are all really, really great things that our state leadership is very responsive to. I got to give credit to our development community as a whole. It's a very responsible group. They're very keyed in to what the market indicators are, which I think is a huge benefit to the great state of Utah. I think some of the challenges, and we've talked a little bit about this. I was part of a discussion with a very large user that was here earlier this year, and they were settling for a 500,000 square foot building. And I say settling in the true sense of the word, because there wasn't a building in our market that was big enough to accommodate them. This is not a single instance. I mean, this is an instance that we are hearing on a regular basis. If there was a 1 million square foot building in the state of Utah, it would have been filled up by multiple users, but being one, not a multi-tenant building. So I think, I'm excited to see the inventory that we have on the books for the coming year, because I think this coming year will be a benchmark year again for the great state of Utah. If we're losing deals, that's a big reason, in my opinion.
Well, we've talked a lot about too that infrastructure is generally thought of surface infrastructure and rail, transportation infrastructure, but power, gas, utilities are a major issue, and they are a deterrent. I mean, they will be something that makes it more and more difficult to land some of the larger users that have that kind of capital expenditure. They're not that transient in terms of regional distribution. It's very tough, particularly in the Northwest Quadrant. The grid is exceptionally stressed. The Rocky Mountain Power does as well, I think, as they can to keep up with it, but the onus is moving and needs to move well away from the developer's purview to the tenant's purview, because they really have to prove what the demand is. And the other thing I would say is we're very fortunate to have Jack Hedge, and we have an inland port, everybody. Just by the way, it's by statute we have an inland port. What we don't have is the rail siding and the drayage capacity and the lengths that are necessary for current modern multimodal. But the Inland Port Authority in and of itself as an economic development tool is unbelievable, and it will be something that's a great attractant to the state of Utah to be able to show that much combined acreage and the ability to go outside of that acreage with our local agreements and otherwise to pull in counties like Tooele, where we have an unbelievable inventory of developable land. The construction prices are less, soils conditions are better. With some new infrastructure, you can be able to bypass. We've talked a lot about this, that north and south, the bottlenecks in I-15, which are absolutely terrible for transportation, with a connection on 73 and the ability to expand that roadway to accommodate triples, you're going to cut an hour of drive time going from I-80 down to past Eagle Mountain, where that bottleneck exists. And that's going to be good for all of the product types that also have to compete with semi-traffic, as well as for the logistics thesis for Salt Lake.
So we've got about 3 minutes left for the panel. I'm going to go down the line. Thank you for touching on the inland port, because that's where we were headed. But clearly, I think it's important that we as leaders continue to invest in infrastructure, which is all types of infrastructure, the utilities, the road, the rail, all of the systems that really drive the market to continue to increase. So that being said, really quickly, lightning round, what do we look like in 5 to 10 years, and what inning are we in? Jared, I'll start with you.
5 to 10 years, I see continued growth in the industrial market. Our local developers and clients continue to build, and manufacturing is going good, flex space is going good, warehouse and distribution is going good. Over the 13 years that I've been doing this, the industrial market has always seemed to be going strong, and I see that continuing the next 5 to 10 years.
Kyle?
Looking at million square footers in places like Tooele and moving north, seeing tenants get more and more focused on their supply chain optimization that's kind of the word du jour for all the people that we deal with. Don't want to be totally blue sky, but we are extremely land constrained. We've heard that all day today. I think we'll be out of ground in the Northwest Quadrant, and that's, squeeze a balloon, it's got to move somewhere. And if we're going to double our population by 2035, we're going to have to do a lot to accommodate that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been known to be the eternal optimist, which I'll take that, but I think it's easy to be that with industrial real estate. It really is, because there are so many indicators and sectors of industrial real estate, and all things are pointing up. I mean, as you look at the global economy, you look at these ports that are just becoming more and more congested. I think what tremendous foresight and how much benefit is there for us that we have somebody like a Jack Hedge who came from two of the most successful ports in the country, with Seattle, Tacoma, and then
To Utah.
yeah, and then Los Angeles, Long Beach to little old Utah. And I think it speaks to where we're going, and that speaks to how the industrial climate is going to weather, these little blips that we're going to have.
Final thoughts?
So I don't know what inning we're in, but I know what game we're in. We are in the Dodgers-Red Sox 2018 World Series game. I think that went 18 innings, 7-something hours. But the thing is that, so let's just say we're in those extra innings. The fundamentals are good. I mean, our vacancy is so low. Rents are increasing. Activity is high. I just don't see anything on the horizon that will make 2020 be any different from 2018. I think we'll continue to see the growth and the prosperity that we've had. One other thing that we've briefly touched on, but we're going to see a lot of new development in the southwest quadrant. So as Mountain View Corridor completes to the 201, that market in the southwest, which, by the way, all the land is basically taken by developers at this point, and there are plans in place to put the buildings up, those buildings will be distribution buildings for the first time. That's traditionally been a manufacturing location, and now we'll see that as a distribution location as well because of that Mountain View Corridor. So the entire market is going to start to fill up, and we'll see manufacturing and distribution everywhere.
We love it so much that the principal's going to kick us off the stage.
I'm not going to kick you off yet. We need some questions answered.
Oh, okay.
Angela, do you want to say anything first before we go into questions?
No, just thank you all for your input and your expertise and sharing it with our group today.
So I think this panel there's been a lot of anticipation and to hear what you guys have to say. A couple of the questions. What are your thoughts on EDC Utah's mega site program and how it affects industrial?
Well, the biggest challenge right now, and you've heard it over and over again today, is labor. We can have the sites, but they've got to be served by infrastructure, and we have to be able to get bodies there. Another deterrent, as we're seeing the world get more and more green, and particularly manufacturers are heavily focused on green manufacturing. We have woefully inadequate public transportation for our industrial market, other than I-15. We got close to 100,000 people a day going out into our industrial market. That's more than what's come to downtown. And I'd challenge each of you to get off at Highway 201 and drive down Bangerter Highway, or get off at California Avenue and do it, and count how many bus stops you see. It's a donut.
And do it at 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think there is any one of us here that doesn't love the resource of the EDCU. Anytime we get a big potential tenant, we love to go in and meet with EDCU. They're so well informed. They have all the resources there in one place. They can talk everything from infrastructure to labor. We love the EDCU and what they're doing for us.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and put up the slide. Thank you. It was mentioned that Utah's industrial base is 40% manufacturing. Mm-hmm. Typically, manufacturing requires a whole lot more utilities, power, exhaust, all of that. How is that being addressed, and how does that affect where these are being located?
Some of it's organic. I mean, you have a lot more aerospace and supply chain following the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter and all of the munitions and avionics and stuff that go along with that up north, into Ogden, Weber, Davis County, where there is a lot of industrial infrastructure that's been there forever, and that grid has capacity. And the utilities have capacity. South in North Utah County, where we have a massive manufacturing base, health and beauty, food grade, et cetera, they don't have some of the same constraints that we have in our valley proper. It's going to be a retardant to expansion at some point in time, and it's an issue that is going to require the development community, the brokerage community, the state, all the various agencies to get creative on how we're going to be able to make the runway for those companies to continue to grow and expand and locate here.
And I think there's a level of responsibility that becomes, this group's, that, there are some strains on resources that we live in a desert, and we know that a lot of these manufacturers require, power is something we can do, gas is something we can do, water is going to be very specific to certain communities, and I think it becomes our part to be educated on where that is so as to not constrain some of these areas that just don't have the ability to do that.
I think it's a bit of a misnomer that all manufacturing is dirty. Some of the cleanest buildings we walk through are manufacturing. You could walk through a big distribution building and the forklifts buzzing back and forth will be dirtier than many of our manufacturing facilities.
So with a lot of these going to manufacturing, they require more workforce typically, or can. And in that, sometimes there's a requirement for additional office space. You guys talked about the larger office spaces needing to be part of the industrial sector. How do you attract the millennials and other groups to want to be in that type of an environment?
I don't know about you guys, but it's the first time in last couple of years I've started to hear things like workplace experience in the industrial segment.
And I think spending time with Stuart Thane, who's the only man that shows up to this in his jeans and that guy, I think, the environment is definitely a big part of that. I think, making them feel like they're a part of something.
We're seeing many tenant spaces inside of these warehouses that are actually really cool. There's, gyms for them now, and we are catering to some of these millennials' needs, but there has been a little bit of a change over the past few years where we've seen a lot more of it catered towards their needs and things that would bring them to those buildings.
I did my first ever Shih Tzu clause in a lease this last year. So, things like bringing pets to work, we are seeing interesting clauses in our leases.
Because you almost have to build the office side, higher class, more windows, more light, and then the industrial side, but it's all in the same building. It makes it very
If you go look at the buildings that are being built today, they're so far superior to buildings 20 years ago. And what happens oftentimes is we get the tenants that want to put too much office in there and we can't park it because they do look so good.
I'm well aware of that one. Thank you, industrial panel. Can we get a round of applause?
All right.
You got this one?